Hello. Tomorrow will be the 108th birthday of Mrs. Rosa Parks, who has long been a champion for equity and for transit in many ways. So to celebrate her long legacy, both throughout the country and here in Detroit, we are bringing together a set of community activists from across the Detroit region who focus on issues ranging from community development to transit to disability rights, and who all have a deep experience in activism throughout the city. And we're doing this as a part of a national transit equity days. There are groups all across the country who are having similar discussions today and tomorrow. So this is just the start. To begin, I'd like to ask each person on the panel to take a moment to both introduce yourself and your background, as well as to explain a little bit about what transit equity means to you. Could we start perhaps with Nicole?
Well, good afternoon, everyone. And Megan, thank you so much for having me here. My name is Nicole Brown, and I'm a proud member of the True Board of Directors. And so for me, when I think about transportation equity, I reflect on something that I feel like most people don't really think about, which is the Civil Rights Act of 1964 under Title IX. And it really requires that transit agencies do no harm to low income and non-white communities when making service and fare changes, right? And so that's amazing and that's great to be able to focus on. But when we look at the history of our country, looking at the history and development of cities and communities, you really have to look far beyond that. And so it's looking at, more than just looking at how do we change, how do we really reflect upon inequitable policies that have created the atmosphere for these things to be able to happen throughout the history of community development, and really look to the broader context of like, how are we now fixing that system, and how are we ensuring that transportation is done in an equitable way that considers not only race as a factor, but also looking at the social impacts, the environmental impacts as well, when we're talking about creating a transit system that is equitable for all, because all of those issues have higher than normal direct impacts to communities of color.
Excellent point. Thank you for starting that off there. Renard, would you like to introduce yourself and share a little bit about what transit equity means to you?
Thank you. Thank you, Megan, for having me on. I'm Renard Monczunski. I've been an organizer with the Detroit People's Platform, actually first starting as a volunteer since 2014. So I've been doing this for 6 years. As a long-term resident in Detroit, I've grown up with a service that I could rely on to get to school, to see family and friends. And this is when I no longer depended on rides. Transit equity to me means that regardless of your neighborhood, your race, your background, where you grow up, your zip code should not be an impediment towards accessing transit, first and foremost. And transit equity to me means ensuring that people that are the most impacted, which in the city of Detroit, having an 87% Black ridership, but no voice in the decision-making power in transit in terms of budget, oversight, things of that sort. That's what it means to me. It means that people of all ability statuses can use our system and are treated with dignity as well too. And it also means that our voices matter and are heard. And that is the spirit of the Civil Rights Act. And also, I would like to say Title VI. It really is the spirit of that, stemming from the Montgomery bus boycott. So transit equity is it's an extension of this long fight for transit and civil rights justice and racial justice in that regard.
Excellent. Very, very good point. And I appreciate you bringing it back to, you need to get where you need to go. There's a personal and a global aspect to these. Jeffrey, what would you like to add to, would you like to introduce yourself and then add a little to this discussion?
Yes, good afternoon. My name is Jeffrey Nolish. I am the Policy Director for Detroit Disability Power. We are a local disability justice organization working to build political power of and with Detroit's disability community. When I think about transit equity, I think I use the language of mobility justice. And to ensure mobility justice for the disability community, we want to ensure people with disabilities have access to quality transportation and mobility options to move freely, easily, safely, fairly, and unafraid around our communities. And I think that one other thing I can add to this point would be, when we talk about disability justice, it's really rooted in a framework of 10 principles. So what I'm reflecting on, if I'm doing a good job of advocating for the outcome of disability justice, we want to make sure that we're hitting the high notes of intersectionality, leadership of the most impacted, anti-capitalist politics, cross-movement solidarity, recognizing wholeness, sustainability, commitment to cross-disability solidarity, interdependence, and then collective access and collective liberation. Thank you.
A lot to unpack there, but some excellent points. This is definitely not, this cannot possibly be a siloed issue. Mason, your organization was founded to some extent based on the work of Ms. Rosa Parks. Can you introduce yourself and your group and your thoughts on this topic?
Absolutely. My name is Mason Herson-Hord. I'm an organizer with the Motor City Freedom Riders, and we're a Metro Detroit bus rider organization. And our motto is that transportation is freedom. We always seek to try to frame transit and transit problems in terms of the broader struggle for civil rights and racial and economic equality, and believe that expansion of transit is really a matter of expanding the freedom to move for all people. I think transit equity we thought of as two things. I think transit equity is about equity in transit, in the equality of people's ability to move. And I think it's also about the role that transit plays as part of social equality more broadly, as kind of a necessary component for equity in education and economic rights and housing and a number of other issues. I think that the organization of most transportation and mobility around personal automobiles has kind of helped cultivate this myth that people can freely move around on their own. But I think it's worth keeping in mind that nobody has mobility on their own. We all depend on others in some fashion to move around for the vehicles and the basic infrastructure that lets us get to where we need to go to access what we need to live. It's just that presently, most of the resources to make that possible are only doing so for people wealthy enough or able-bodied enough to own and operate a car. And so I think transit equity is about building a system of like a broad model of people being able to move in a way that's equally accessible to all. And I don't think there's any way for that to be achieved without really strong commitment to public transportation. And I think we can, especially in highly segregated metro regions like Detroit, very clearly see the importance of transit and transit expansion as breaking down the walls of racial segregation and ensuring that there aren't barriers for people to be able to move around the region freely and that's why transit equity in particular is so important.
Excellent point. These are very much interrelated topics. And actually, in order to try to capture some of these ideas that you guys are all sharing, we have set up a Jamboard, that's what it's called, to try to capture some of these different ideas in a written way. So I invite anybody who is interested to take a look at this Jamboard, and which should be shared in the notes, and add your thoughts. What else does transit equity mean? Now, before we move on to the next section, I wanted to circle back, Jeffrey. You brought up a great point about not only do people have to be able to get around, but they have to feel safe within, they have to be safe within their streets, within their sidewalks, within their communities. Can you expand a little bit on what that means?
Yeah, you know, I mentioned this from my friend Anthony Taylor in Minnesota a few times in recent meetings, but I don't think that we can achieve transit justice, transit equity, mobility justice, you know, insert our terminology, unless we consider race, unless we consider sex, unless we consider disability, all of the other differences that make a difference as we maneuver the world. And it's really important that we recognize, give recognition to, and reflect on that in the last decade, we've seen a number of police violence related deaths in the mobility space in our rights of way. So Eric Gardner was killed on a sidewalk, and Michael Brown was shot in a street, and George Floyd was killed in a street in a bike lane. And none of those mobility options were intended for that purpose. And so it's one thing, we were talking about this the other day in another Zoom meeting. It's one thing to look at maybe an Uber fleet in Detroit getting all electrified vehicles, right? That's fantastic, cool. You know, we're fighting for environmental justice, reducing greenhouse gas emissions. But if none of those vehicles are wheelchair access vehicles, then we really didn't hit the kind of justice that we're trying to. I mentioned yesterday that the same thing, if I have a friend that's unjustly pulled over by an electrical car, courtesy of whatever company, that's not getting to where we want to go or we should be going. So, you know, people need to be moving unafraid. And you can't do that alone by just rolling out the right kind of infrastructure or the right kind of mobility option. There has to be honest to God, agape love performing in all of our actions and in what we do.
Thank you for bringing that forward. Very, very important. Now, I know that this fight, well, maybe not under this name, but these efforts have been going on for many decades, and that several of our organizations have been working on this for many years. What progress have you seen? What's working? Are there any examples of progress and improvement? Not completely solving the problem, because we know that that's not going to happen in any short term, if ever, but what progress have we seen towards the type of equity that we need in our transportation systems and in our community? Who wants to jump in? Renard, please.
I'm going to mention something that involves every organization in this room. And over last year, and then the summer for the transit justice team, the Detroiter Bill of Rights is where we're leaning towards the future, right? Where we actually have a right to mobility, access, and public transit enshrined in the new City of Detroit Charter. And And then there's organizing for increased transparency and also public input when it comes to budget decisions, and also a master transit plan, which will all be part of our new charter. So in summation, it's organizing to shift policy towards equity. And that's how that works as well too. And I appreciate Nicole Brown mentioning the Civil Rights Act of 1964, a lot of work in organizing, Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King and many other mega evers have brought towards that. So to be part of this new process for United States, like, for the largest Black city in the United States is impressive. That leans us towards more progressive policies for transit that exist in other cities as well too, that have different demographics. But to enshrine that as a right, mobility and access in public transit is phenomenal, and a foundational document for city government as well too. Also would say that increasing the voice of people, like a pandemic has really kept us all here and home. But with, we've seen this before the pandemic, more people are talking about transit in public hearings, in public comments, not only to our transit department agencies, but also to our city government as well too. And that's also been something that we've all moved the needle towards as well. So transit, and then one more thing I want to say is that bus riders, transit riders, paratransit riders are now an advocacy constituency. That is major. In an automotive, like big three zone, bus riders now have a voice and say. I think that's very important to mention in terms of progress and equity as well. So I tend to see it that way in terms of policy shift and narrative shifting and power shifting.
Excuse me, who else wants to share?
I would agree with everything that Renard said. And I think that we've been building toward this like over the last 10 years. You can look at cities across the country, and I was going to bring up Boston and their municipal metropolitan planning office, which started sort of developing a lot of the things that are in the, that are going to be in the Bill of Rights. For the Transit Bill of Rights in Detroit, and really looking at a lot of the recommendations that they were making. And one of the things that really spoke to me that you're seeing reflected now, which is going to be enshrined in the charter, is really this amplification of community voice, right? Within the participation and the planning process of it, and giving people the really, not necessarily, I'm not going to say giving people the power, but also giving them the microphone to really make their voices heard, and making sure that their voices are not only heard, but that information is actually being acted upon within the planning processes within our city governments. And I think the other piece of that is within that transparency, there is power when it comes to information, right? So understanding from the other side, like what are some of the constraints that our transit agencies face and trying to give service, and so that those groups, instead of working against each other, can begin working toward advocacy of federal policies that, quite frankly, are outdated and need to be looked at to how do we fund our transit agencies. Right now, our transit agencies get 40% of their funding from the fare boxes. And so you look at cities that are high areas of poverty, and you look at cities particularly that have been hit hard by budget crises due to COVID and the pandemic responses. You have cities that are trying to figure out how to work their way out of debt while providing good quality services to their cities and to their residents. And so I think that being able to engage residents in those conversations, having things like participatory budgeting processes also help to move the needle toward creating a much more equitable transit system that works for all, with a truly integrated community voice and community voice within that process.
Absolutely. Well, things like participatory budgeting may not sound exciting or sexy. It is, in fact, the types of actions that enable the people's priorities to really be advanced. Jeffrey, you want to add anything to that, or share any progress you've seen?
Yeah, so progress in improving transit equity in the disability space might look like the creation of the Office of Disability Affairs at the City of Detroit. And so many disability advocates have been fighting for this for the better part of a decade, if not longer. And it's been realized, maybe a little quietly this spring, but well, in the last 6 months, it's been realized, and they're beginning to apply some staff to it. And there's another effort in the Charter Revision Commission to create it to be permanent, as well as accompany it with the Disability Justice Commission. The point is that we are hoping to ultimately utilize that place as a hub to really help to level disability consciousness throughout the city government. So DDOT, mobility innovation, public works, planning, housing and revitalization department. All these departments can really benefit from having better interdepartmental conversations about disability. Not every shop needs to reinvent the wheel, and hopefully this will be the glue that pulls things together. One other thing, obviously we're seeing this vaccination rollout for COVID-19, the various eligible communities. And my hope is that the state and the city come together and offer mobile vaccinations. I think that would be fantastic. Yes, we need shots in arms, but not everyone can get to the TCF Center to get a shot in an arm. Not everyone can come out of their home to go to a mobile vehicle. We would love to see nurses going into and accessing people's homes that give consent and are part of a process in order to mitigate this pandemic. So I think that's in the works. My hope is that we'll see it made real.
I think that's a great segue in our last 6 or 7 minutes into what needs to be done. What are some of the concrete actions that need to be taken in the next year, in the next 2 or 3 years, to actually bring this vision into a reality? Mason, I didn't mean to skip you. Do you have areas you want to share of what either progress or what needs to be done?
Sure. I think I could maybe combine those. I think one of the most important small bits of progress in recent years has been the rollout of Smart's Fast service, which I think is the only truly regional element of transit service in Metro Detroit. One of the only couple of lines that break down the 8-mile barrier. And I think that the kinds of areas where there's the most possibility for improvement in transit equity are expansions of things like that. Bringing in new resources and funding to be able to provide frequent regional connections of those kinds. I think another interesting development that's happened this year is the elimination of fares as part of the COVID response. That was something we demanded along with the drivers as a pandemic safety precaution to limit the contact between the drivers and members of the public. But I think it's also kind of been an interesting experiment in the potential obsolescence of fares as a means of providing transit service. I mean, we already know that DDOT and SMART are making only a tiny fraction of their budgets through fares, and there have been some really exciting rollouts of fareless transit in other places in the U.S. just this year. I'm thinking of Olympia, Washington, and Kansas City. And I think what these indicate is, on one hand, kind of a commitment that to the idea that transit is a public good that should be funded by the public rather than through charging often the poorest and least financially capable members of our society, and also trying to make it as attractive and convenient for everyone along the way. And I think that's kind of indicative of how, if you put equity at the center of our goals for effective transit, it helps to turn it into something that works better for even those of us who are more well off. So we're hoping that DDOT and SMART and the RTA will learn some interesting lessons from kind of this unintended year of fareless transit, and see if that's something that could feasibly be taken up in the future.
Excellent point. I know, Renard, this is something that you guys have also called for. Do you want to build on that? Not only that we should figure out a way to have long-term fare-free transit, but what are some of the other pieces you feel are needed?
Definitely to add to that, it should start to turn to a national movement. And I agree that, transit is part of the public commons. And one of the things we need to do is stop this divide between fixed line and paratransit and start to look at our system holistically, and then make it bring down those barriers for people that use paratransit to be able to have the top quality service that they're federally and legally and just morally entitled to as well too. So I think there needs to be expansion in that regard, and that means keeping it public. Stop this privatization of our transit system, stops this financial strip mining and investing mindset into that, and bring it back to the public, to the commons. What we've all learned is that public transit in all forms is a critical part of the pandemic response to our international medical emergency. It is crucial. It is worth making these changes and sacrifices on the funding side to ensure that we can just get on the bus and get off. So where I think we need to move forward is changing the perception of bus riders and transit users. It's racism. It's a racist sort of like undertone to it, right? And a classist undertone to that as well. That's what we need to do moving forward. And I also think that we need to change how funding is done. It's also another racist sort of system where certain like cars get 90% of the money. And then, we've historically known and studied that highways and roads have destroyed historically thriving Black communities and other communities as well too. So we need to get infrastructure and funding in a very equitable and centering those injustices, ensuring that they are rectified. But I think a low-hanging fruit is fare-free service. The first city in the United States is Commerce City, California, 1962. There's about 34, at least my research on that. I think that's something that this new federal government can do. In the interim. Let's just go there with it. Let's join some other countries that have done that. And that way that public transit is really an attractive service. Leave your car parked or, just get on the bus and get to where you need to go. And I think we're so close to that. I really believe so.
Love that you mentioned that this needs to be a national movement, because that's a great segue to say this is in fact today's event is part of a national effort. Transit equity for civil rights and a healthy planet. There are dozens of groups all across the country, from labor unions to transit rider groups to other activists from all across the country, are coming together today to talk about transit equity. In fact, starting this afternoon, I think it's at 3, starting this afternoon and going on through tomorrow, there's going to be a community hearing, bringing together individuals from all across the country to share why transit is important to them and what needs to happen in their communities to improve the transit system. So look for hashtag transit equity today and tomorrow, and there should be lots of great information about what's happening elsewhere. Now, I know we want to finish up shortly. Jeffrey, would you like to share any thoughts on what needs to happen? Where do we go from here?
Yeah, this is Jeffrey. Everything needs to happen. So, I mean, to be brief, I'll hit some bullet points. For Detroit Disability Power, in terms of transportation and mobility, we want to increase accessible public transportation and mobility options to allow people to move freely, easily, fairly, safely, and unafraid. We want to increase information, physical, financial, and geographic access in the for-hire vehicle sector, such as taxis, Uber, Lyft, et cetera. We want to invest and innovate in and expand public transportation, regional transportation, and paratransit. And we want to evaluate and improve mobility-centered infrastructure. So entrances, egresses, sidewalks, crosswalks, curb cuts, and ramps. Lastly, one thing you can do right now is if people were to search the I-375 improvement project that MDOT is doing, you can find a way to give a public comment between now and February 19th. And I would suggest you give a public comment that ultimately says, we would like to see pedestrian friendly signals in that project. We would like to prioritize the pedestrian so they don't have to cross 7 lanes of traffic. We would like to see if there's an opportunity to go underneath the street or over the street. We want to be innovative. We don't want just one preferred alternative. We want the best preferred alternative. And we think that we can add to that now. So we'd like your help. Thanks.
Excellent. That is a great example of something that is happening. There are decisions happening every day that impact our transportation systems and our ways and how we get around, whether that's, and moving that away from being so auto-centric to really being people-focused is really one of the underlying needs here. Now, we do need to wrap up. We were talking right before we started that this is such a big topic that we can't possibly tackle everything in this short 30 minutes. So we are going to be looking to have additional conversations of this sort over the coming months to bring in additional voices and to narrow in on some of the specific pieces. But in the last few minutes we have, Nicole, would you like to give us some closing remarks about what is needed and where we can go from here?
Yes, absolutely. So I think that we can look at the appointment of Secretary Buttigieg as a really bright light for transportation across our country. And so with that, I do get back to funding. I think that we need to look for new and innovative ways in which we can advocate for federal funding so that it is not so centric. And it appears to be that is that appears to be the pathway that the Department of Transportation is going toward, where it's not just going to be so centric on infrastructure for highways and streets infrastructure, but really looking at public transportation, but also looking locally here within our state. How do we look at funding our transit agencies so that we can get to a place where we can truly have like a fairless system that's accessible for all residents, whether you live in our urban centers, whether you live in our rural communities, and anywhere in between. So making sure that we're setting the structure for that to be able to happen. Also looking at, as we begin to see the light at the end of the tunnel, as COVID vaccines are here, and we have to begin to plan for what does our future of our city and our state look like. The future of our movements, of patterns for work and livability are going to be different. It may not be all pathways lead to downtown as like the largest job center, right? So it is going to be looking at how do we have those conversations with community members at the table, economic developers at the table, the city at the table, to really be able to look at the best new pathways for public transportation to serve the residents and stakeholders at the highest and best ways for the city of Detroit. And then last but not least, in looking at those job centers and investments that are continuing to still come to the city of Detroit, how can we make sure that transportation planning is a part of all of those job creation center processes.
Excellent. These are very much interrelated topics that you can't solve one without touching on many of the others, from jobs to racial justice to community development to disability access to sidewalks and pedestrian access. We clearly have a lot of work before us, but it is great to see such big ideas and such thoughtful input from all of you, from all of these wonderful organizations, all of which would be great to get involved in and to support for anyone who's watching. Detroit People's Platform, Motor City Freedom Riders, Detroit Future City, Detroit Disability Power, and Transportation Riders United are all working hard to fight this fight, and we look forward to continuing this conversation and continuing to advocate for a truly just and equitable transportation system so everyone can get where they need to go. Thanks so much, everyone, and have a wonderful day.